The funny thing about concrete is that people think once it hardens, the story is over. Mine didn't even begin until someone poured it across my driveway. The first thing I noticed wasn't the wall. It was the smell. Fresh concrete has a sharp, chalky scent that hangs in the morning air, mixing with diesel exhaust and wet lumber. I rolled down my truck window, expecting to hear birds and sprinklers like every other Saturday in our quiet Colorado neighborhood. Instead, I heard the steady beep, beep, beep of a cement mixer backing away from what used to be the entrance to my home. I hit the brakes so hard my coffee splashed across the dashboard. There, less than 30 feet in front of me, stood a brand new garage. Its white paneled door faced the street with fresh paint still gleaming in the early sunlight, and the entire sidewall stretched directly across my driveway, as if my property had never existed. Workers were loading tools into their pickups while one of them peeled orange caution tape from a wooden stake planted exactly where my mailbox had always lined up with the drive. My tires crunched against loose gravel as I stepped out, the cool morning air carrying the smell of sawdust and curing concrete. For a second, I honestly wondered if I had somehow pulled into the wrong neighborhood. Then I saw the old maple tree my father planted when I was 10 years old. Same tree, same porch, same house. Only now, the driveway he'd poured with his own hands 30 years earlier disappeared beneath someone else's brand new construction. A slow clap echoed behind me. I turned and found Karen Whitmore standing on her front porch, wearing spotless white sneakers and holding a steaming coffee mug like she was watching the final scene of a movie she'd already seen 100 times. Her smile never reached her eyes. "Looks like you'll have to find another way in," she called out with the kind of cheerful voice people use when they're pretending they aren't ruining your morning. A couple of neighbors froze halfway through their walks. Nobody said a word. They simply looked from me to the garage and back again, as if they couldn't decide whether this was a misunderstanding or something much worse. My name is Ethan Walker. I'm 38 years old, a civil engineer by trade, and I've spent nearly my entire career reading surveys, permits, easements, and property lines that most people never think about. My father taught me something long before he taught me how to drive. He used to tap freshly poured concrete with the handle of his finishing trowel and say, "Land remembers the truth, son. Paper proves it." At the time, I thought he was just talking about construction. Standing there that morning with the smell of wet concrete filling my lungs and a stranger's garage blocking the only path to my house, I finally understood what he meant. Karen believed she'd buried my driveway beneath thousands of pounds of concrete. What she didn't realize was that she had also buried herself beneath a mountain of evidence that was about to change everything. I bought this house 12 years earlier, back when the neighborhood still felt like a place where people waved instead of measuring each other's grass with a ruler. It sat on a little more than half an acre outside Denver, tucked against a gentle slope where afternoon sunlight always landed on the front porch first. Most people saw an ordinary ranch house with faded brick and an oversized driveway. I saw the last project my father ever finished. He was not a wealthy man. He spent 34 years pouring foundations, repairing sidewalks, and building retaining walls all across the county. His hands always smelled faintly of concrete dust and machine oil, even after he washed them for dinner. When I was 8 years old, he let me press my tiny hand into the wet edge of the driveway before smoothing it over with his steel trowel. He laughed and told me that good builders leave their mark even when nobody can see it anymore. Every crack, every expansion joint, every inch of that driveway carried a memory that could not be measured on a blueprint. After he passed away, I inherited the property, but what I really inherited was his respect for doing things the right way. That lesson followed me into my career. I became a civil engineer because I loved understanding how roads, foundations, drainage systems, and property boundaries all fit together like pieces of a puzzle. While other people saw lines on paper, I saw stories written in measurements, deeds, and surveys. A quarter of an inch could settle an argument that had lasted 20 years. A forgotten easement could completely change who actually owned a piece of land. That was why the scene in front of my house felt so impossible. Nothing about that garage made sense. Buildings do not accidentally end up several feet across a neighbor's driveway. Too many people sign drawings. Too many inspections happen. Too many permits move across too many desks. Unless someone stopped paying attention, or someone counted on everyone else never checking the details. Karen Whitmore had moved into the neighborhood about 5 years earlier after selling several high-end properties across the county. She drove a pearl white luxury sport utility vehicle that always looked freshly detailed, and she somehow managed to become president of the Homeowners Association within her second year. At first, she seemed friendly enough, always smiling at board meetings and talking about protecting property values. Then the letters started appearing on people's doors. Wrong mailbox color. Decorative lights left up too long. Garden sheds painted the wrong shade of gray. Little by little, the neighborhood stopped feeling relaxed. Conversations became whispers. Neighbors avoided disagreements because nobody wanted another certified envelope from the association. I mostly stayed out of it. My work kept me busy, and my house had never violated a single rule. Looking back now, I realized Karen probably mistook my silence for weakness. She saw an engineer who minded his own business, lived alone, and rarely attended meetings. She never imagined that the quiet man she overlooked spent every working day solving problems created by people who believed measurements could be ignored. She certainly never imagined that the one structure she was most proud of would eventually become the strongest evidence against her. By Monday morning, the smell of fresh paint had replaced the scent of curing concrete, and Karen was already acting as though the entire situation had been settled years ago instead of over a single weekend. Decorative flower pots appeared beside the new garage. A polished brass house number had been mounted above the oversized door. Someone even planted fresh shrubs along the side wall that now cut straight across what had always been the only entrance to my property. Watching it all come together felt surreal, like seeing strangers redecorate your living room while insisting they own the place. Karen loved an audience. Every afternoon, she seemed to find an excuse to stand outside talking with neighbors, gesturing proudly toward the addition as if it were the neighborhood's newest landmark. She had a way of smiling that made disagreement seem almost impolite. Her voice always sounded calm, polished, and confident, but underneath every sentence was the quiet assumption that her opinion carried more weight than anyone else's. I had watched that pattern for years. She rarely raised her voice. She did not have to. She preferred committee meetings, official letters, and carefully chosen words that made ordinary homeowners feel as though questioning her was somehow unreasonable. One neighbor repainted his front door after receiving 3 violation notices in 2 weeks. Another removed a small vegetable garden because Karen claimed it looked inconsistent with community aesthetics, even though the guidelines never mentioned gardens at all. People stopped arguing because arguing took time, money, and energy. Karen understood something that had nothing to do with property law. Most people simply wanted peace. She counted on that. As I stood near the edge of the blocked driveway, she walked over carrying a thin folder with the Homeowners Association logo printed neatly across the front. She handed it to me with both hands and smiled as though she were delivering a welcome gift. Inside were updated neighborhood improvement documents, revised traffic access recommendations, and a notice explaining that my future vehicle access should be routed through a secondary entrance that did not actually exist anywhere on my property. According to the paperwork, the changes benefited overall community appearance and improved shared access flow. I read every page twice, feeling the rough texture of the paper against my fingertips while a light breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass across the yard. None of it mentioned my recorded property boundary. None of it mentioned surveys. None of it mentioned county records. It simply assumed the new reality had already replaced the old one. Karen folded her arms and looked directly at the garage with unmistakable satisfaction. She told me that neighborhoods evolve and reasonable homeowners adapt to progress. Then she added that fighting improvements usually ended badly for everyone involved. It sounded less like advice and more like a prediction. I looked past her toward the concrete wall standing across the driveway my father had built decades earlier. Something about its alignment kept bothering me. Engineers develop instincts after enough years in the field. Sometimes a retaining wall feels wrong before you ever measure it. Sometimes a building sits at an angle that your eyes notice long before your tape measure confirms it. Standing there with the afternoon sun reflecting off the bright white garage door, I felt that same quiet instinct settle into the back of my mind. Karen believed she had finished her biggest project. I was beginning to suspect she had only finished building the evidence. The next morning, I drove to the county planning office before sunrise, partly because I wanted answers and partly because I needed to get away from the sight of that wall sitting across my driveway. The courthouse always smelled faintly of old paper, floor polish, and burnt coffee from the vending machine near the entrance. It was strangely comforting. Buildings like that dealt in facts instead of opinions. I requested every publicly available document connected to both properties, including recorded surveys, subdivision plats, permit applications, and inspection records. The clerk disappeared into the archive room and returned 20 minutes later, pushing a small cart stacked with oversized folders that looked as though they had not been opened in years. I carried everything to a wooden table beneath a fluorescent light and started reading one page at a time. Hours slipped by while the soft hum of the air conditioning echoed through the nearly empty records room. Every signature, every stamp, every handwritten notation told part of the neighborhood's history. Around noon I noticed something unusual. The permit drawing for Karen's addition looked clean enough at first glance, but the dimensions referenced a side property line that did not match the original subdivision survey. I checked it again, then a third time. The discrepancy was small on paper, just enough that most homeowners would never recognize it, but in the real world it translated into several feet. Several feet happened to be exactly the amount of driveway now trapped behind her new garage. My pulse stayed calm, but my engineer's instincts suddenly became impossible to ignore. I requested the digital survey files and compared them against the county geographic information system. The colored boundary lines aligned perfectly with the original plat that had been recorded decades before either of us owned our homes. Karen's construction did not. It was as if someone had treated an old sketch as though it were a legal survey. Before leaving, I asked whether the final inspection had already been completed. The clerk searched the system, frowned slightly, and shook her head. The project still showed as pending, with additional documentation expected before full approval. That single sentence stayed with me all afternoon. Pending meant unfinished. Unfinished meant nothing had become permanent yet. Driving home, I slowed as I reached my street. Fresh landscaping framed the new structure, and sunlight reflected off the pristine garage door like it had always belonged there. Karen waved cheerfully from across the yard while chatting with another board member, completely confident that the neighborhood had accepted the new normal. I waved back just as politely. There was no point arguing over measurements while standing on the sidewalk. Measurements belonged on surveys, permit drawings, and inspection reports. As I parked along the curb outside my own blocked entrance, I looked once more at the perfectly straight wall stretching across the concrete my father had poured. It still looked solid. It still looked expensive. It still looked permanent. But appearances had never impressed me nearly as much as documentation, and for the first time since this whole mess began, I quietly realized that the strongest part of Karen's new garage might also be the weakest part of her entire plan. I did not hire a lawyer. Not yet. People assume the first move in a property dispute is filing a lawsuit, but years of engineering had taught me that rushing usually creates more problems than it solves. Instead, I started collecting facts the same way I approached every construction project. Quietly, methodically. Every morning before work, I parked along the street because I still could not reach my garage. The cool air carried the smell of damp grass and fresh mulch while my work boots scraped against the curb instead of the driveway my father had built. Every evening, I returned with another folder tucked beneath my arm. Survey copies, permit records, inspection schedules, archived aerial photographs. None of them proved everything by themselves, but together they started fitting like pieces of a puzzle. Karen, meanwhile, behaved as though the entire neighborhood had already accepted her version of reality. She hosted a small gathering one Saturday afternoon to show off the addition. Folding chairs appeared on the lawn. Lemonade pitchers sat beneath striped umbrellas. Neighbors wandered through the new garage, complimenting the polished concrete floor and custom storage cabinets. I drove past on my way home, listening to laughter drift across the street while sunlight reflected off the smooth white garage door. Karen noticed me immediately. She raised her glass with a confident smile, almost as if she wanted me to admire what now stood across my own property. I simply nodded and continued inside my house through the narrow side gate, carrying another stack of documents instead of my frustration. That Monday, I hired a licensed surveyor named Daniel Brooks, someone I had worked with years earlier on municipal roadway projects. Daniel never guessed. He measured. We met before sunrise. While the neighborhood was still quiet except for sprinklers ticking across nearby lawns and robins hopping through the flower beds. He unloaded total stations, tripods, and survey rods with the calm routine of someone who trusted mathematics more than opinions. Karen stepped outside within minutes. She asked what we were doing. Daniel politely explained that he was conducting a boundary verification requested by the property owner. She laughed softly and said there was no reason because the homeowners association had already reviewed everything. Daniel smiled without arguing and returned to his measurements. Surveyors have a habit of letting numbers speak for them. For nearly 4 hours, he worked from one monument marker to another, checking bearings, elevations, and recorded coordinates against the county control network. I watched him write notes without saying much, but every now and then he glanced toward the side wall of the garage with an expression that looked increasingly thoughtful. Before packing his equipment, he handed me a preliminary field sketch. He did not make dramatic speeches. He simply tapped one penciled line with the eraser of his mechanical pencil and quietly said, "Ethan, I recommend you wait for the final report before making any decisions. But if these measurements hold, this project has a much bigger problem than a disagreement between neighbors." As his truck disappeared down the street, I looked back at the garage one more time. It still appeared flawless from the outside. The landscaping was neat. The paint was perfect. The concrete looked brand new. Yet I had spent enough years around construction sites to know that the strongest-looking structures sometimes failed because of one line that had been placed in the wrong location before the first shovel ever touched the ground. 3 days later, Daniel called just after sunrise. His voice carried the same calm professionalism I had heard on job sites for years, but there was something different beneath it, the quiet confidence that comes only when measurements remove every remaining doubt. I met him at his office instead of my house. Survey maps covered the walls, and the faint smell of blueprint paper mixed with fresh coffee as he unrolled a large drawing across the conference table. Colored boundary lines stretched across the page in crisp detail. My driveway, Karen's lot, the subdivision monuments. Every recorded measurement matched the county records perfectly. Then he placed his finger on one thick red outline. This is where the garage actually sits. The line crossed directly over my recorded property boundary before cutting across nearly 14 feet of my driveway. My first reaction was not anger. It was disbelief that so many people had signed paperwork without catching something so obvious. Daniel slid another sheet beside the survey. It compared the approved permit drawing with the finished structure. They did not match. The approved plans showed a legal setback that respected every recorded boundary. The completed garage had been built several feet away from that approved location. Somewhere between the approved design and the finished construction, someone had either ignored the plans or relied on incorrect layout information. Either way, the structure standing outside my home no longer matched the permit that authorized it. Daniel leaned back in his chair and folded his arms. If I were reviewing this for a municipality, I would flag it immediately. Those words echoed in my head the entire drive home. The afternoon sun reflected off Karen's spotless garage as though nothing in the world could ever happen to it. She was outside directing landscapers who were installing decorative stone edging around the foundation. Every shovel of fresh mulch, every newly planted shrub, every carefully placed flower made the addition look even more permanent. I almost felt sorry watching them work because none of those improvements changed where the property line actually existed. I quietly walked into my own garage through the side entrance and opened an old metal filing cabinet that had belonged to my father. Inside were weathered folders containing documents he had carefully protected for decades. Original closing paperwork, utility easements, survey certificates. Near the bottom, I found the rolled subdivision plat he always insisted should never be thrown away. The paper had yellowed with age, but the ink remained sharp. I spread it across my workbench beside Daniel's new survey. They matched almost perfectly despite being separated by more than 30 years. I smiled for the first time since this entire ordeal began. My father had always believed that careful records outlast loud arguments. Standing there with the scent of old paper, machine oil, and sawdust surrounding me, I realized every document I needed was finally sitting in front of me. Karen still believed she had won because everyone could see her garage. She had no idea the most important evidence in the neighborhood was hidden inside a quiet filing cabinet that had not been opened in years. Once I knew the facts, I stopped reacting and started preparing. That surprised Karen more than any argument ever could have. She expected angry emails, dramatic confrontations, maybe even a lawyer's letter taped to her front door. Instead, I went back to work every morning like nothing had changed. I waved when she waved. I parked along the curb without complaining. I even thanked the mail carrier for walking the extra distance to reach my front porch. Meanwhile, every evening became another step in building a file that no opinion could overturn. I requested certified copies of the recorded subdivision plat, the original deed, the updated boundary survey, and every permit associated with the addition. I also submitted a public records request for inspection logs, revision notes, and application correspondence. The stack of documents on my dining room table grew thicker each day, filling the room with the familiar scent of fresh paper and printer ink. Daniel delivered his sealed survey package at the end of the week. Every page carried his professional stamp, complete field notes, coordinate references, and photographs taken during the boundary verification. I scanned everything into digital copies and organized the files exactly the way I organized engineering reports on major construction projects. Nothing was left to chance. Dates matched. Measurements matched. Photographs matched. Even the aerial imagery lined up perfectly with the county monument locations. One quiet Saturday morning, I walked the property carrying nothing more than a camera and a notebook. The neighborhood was peaceful except for distant lawn mowers and the soft hiss of sprinklers crossing green lawns. I photographed every visible corner of the garage from public viewpoints, documenting foundation lines, drainage slopes, finished grading, and the landscaping that had now been completed around the structure. The flowers looked beautiful. The stone edging was perfectly straight. The craftsmanship itself was impressive. That almost made the situation more unfortunate because good workmanship could never correct a building placed in the wrong location. Karen noticed me taking photographs. She smiled confidently from across the yard and asked whether I was finally accepting the neighborhood improvement. I smiled back and simply replied that I liked keeping accurate records. She laughed as though that answer confirmed I had given up. What she could not see was that my entire response had shifted from emotion to documentation. The following Monday, I assembled one final package. The survey report rested on top, followed by the recorded plat, permit comparison drawings, inspection status records, property photographs, and supporting county documents. Each section was labeled with colored tabs, so anyone reviewing it could follow the sequence without confusion. Looking at the completed binder, I remembered something my father used to say after finishing a concrete pour. Preparation is the part nobody applauds, but it decides how everything ends. I closed the binder, slid it into my truck, and took one last glance at the spotless garage standing across my driveway. Karen believed she had built something permanent. I was about to place the evidence into the hands of people whose job was deciding whether permanent structures had been built where the law actually allowed them to stand. The county responded faster than I expected. Late Tuesday afternoon, my phone rang while I was reviewing bridge inspection reports at work. The building compliance officer introduced herself, confirmed receipt of my documentation, and thanked me for organizing everything so clearly. She said cases involving property boundaries often became complicated because people submitted opinions instead of evidence. Mine was different. Every survey matched. Every measurement aligned. Every supporting document pointed in the same direction. She told me an official site inspection had been scheduled for Thursday morning. I thanked her, hung up, and went right back to work. There was nothing left to argue about. Thursday arrived cool and clear. The air smelled like fresh grass after overnight irrigation, and the neighborhood looked exactly as it always had. Children waited for school buses. Dog walkers exchanged friendly greetings. Lawn sprinklers clicked softly across neatly trimmed yards. Then two county vehicles rolled slowly onto the street. They were followed by another truck carrying survey equipment. Nobody rushed. Nobody raised their voice. The inspectors simply unloaded tripods, reviewed permit drawings, and began checking measurements against permanent survey monuments that had been buried beneath the neighborhood decades before either Karen or I lived there. Karen stepped outside carrying a folder almost identical to mine. She greeted everyone confidently, explaining that the Homeowners Association had already approved the project and that the matter had been exaggerated by an unhappy neighbor. One inspector listened politely before pointing toward the official survey markers already established in the pavement. Within minutes, laser measurements replaced conversation. Clipboards replaced assumptions. Facts replaced confidence. I watched quietly from the sidewalk while sunlight reflected off the bright white garage door that had blocked my driveway for weeks. The inspection lasted nearly 3 hours. Every foundation corner was measured. Every setback was verified. Every permit dimension was compared against the finished construction. Finally, the lead inspector gathered the team beside the driveway and completed several forms. One bright orange notice was carefully attached near the front entrance of the garage. Even from where I stood, the bold lettering was impossible to miss. The structure had failed final approval because it did not conform to the permitted location or recorded property boundaries. Any further occupancy or project completion was suspended pending corrective action. Karen's expression changed for the first time since this entire situation began. She stopped smiling. She asked whether the issue could simply be corrected through amended paperwork. The inspector answered calmly that recorded property lines could not be moved by paperwork alone. Any permanent solution would have to comply with existing legal boundaries before a certificate of completion could ever be issued. Over the following weeks, more letters arrived. The lender requested clarification because the unfinished structure affected the property's recorded improvements. The insurance company requested updated compliance documentation before extending coverage. Contractors who had expected final payment began asking questions after learning the inspection remained unresolved. None of those events happened because I argued with anyone. They happened because one incorrect foundation location triggered every review process connected to the project. Watching the neighborhood from my front porch one quiet evening, I realized the concrete wall that had seemed so permanent on the first morning was no longer the center of the story. Documentation had quietly taken its place, and documents have a way of reaching places that even the tallest walls never can. It took another 6 weeks before the final chapter unfolded. By then, the bright orange notice had faded slightly under the Colorado sun, but its message had not changed. Every few days, another contractor visited Karen's property, measured the garage, shook a head, and drove away. The structure could not be approved where it stood because it crossed a recorded property line and blocked lawful access to my driveway. There was no shortcut, no special exception, and no committee vote that could rewrite a deed filed decades earlier. One crisp October morning, I woke to a familiar sound. Only this time it was different. Instead of concrete trucks arriving, I heard backup alarms from demolition equipment positioning carefully along the curb. The cool air carried the scent of damp leaves, diesel engines, and freshly cut lumber. I stepped onto my front porch with a cup of coffee and watched workers place protective fencing around the garage they had proudly completed only weeks before. Nobody argued. Nobody raised a voice. The crew simply followed revised engineering drawings approved by the county. One section after another came down with deliberate precision until sunlight reached the concrete driveway for the first time since this entire ordeal had begun. Karen stood quietly beside her front walk speaking with inspectors and contractors. She looked tired, not angry. The confidence that had once carried every conversation had been replaced by the exhausting reality of correcting an expensive mistake. I did not celebrate. I did not say, "I told you so." There was nothing left to prove. The law had already spoken through surveys, permits, and recorded boundaries. By late afternoon, the last construction vehicle pulled away, leaving my driveway completely visible again. Fresh tire marks crossed the concrete my father had poured so many years earlier, and for the first time in months, I walked its full length without stepping around barriers or landscaping that had never belonged there. I unlocked my garage, climbed into my old pickup, and slowly drove down the same stretch of concrete where my father had once shown an 8-year-old boy how careful work lasts longer than pride. The familiar sound of tires rolling across the expansion joints almost made me smile. Everything looked exactly the way it had before, yet somehow it meant much more now. A week later, the Homeowners Association announced new procedures requiring independent boundary verification before approving any future construction near shared property lines. Board elections followed that winter, and new leadership promised greater transparency and stricter compliance with county records instead of assumptions. The neighborhood gradually returned to normal. People waved again during evening walks. Children rode bicycles down the street without stopping to stare at a blocked driveway. Even the maple tree my father planted seemed to cast its afternoon shade across the restored entrance exactly as it always had. Every now and then someone asks whether the entire experience was worth the months of frustration. I always give the same answer. Concrete can be poured in a single day. A garage can be built in a few weeks. But respect for property, patience, and the truth recorded on paper often outlast them all. My father was right all those years ago. Land remembers the truth. Paper proves it. And justice never needed to shout because it arrived one measured line at a time.